My name is Jaykus, and I was involved in organizing this session. For those of you who don't know me, which I think is a lot of the audience, I am a former faculty member in food science at NC State University in Raleigh, and I'm a food microbiologist. I claim no expertise in nutrition at all. I did run a very, very large interdisciplinary grant on human enteric viruses, specifically noroviruses in foods. I'm still getting feedback, a little bit of feedback, I think. If I need to go to the regular mic, I will. And I don't claim to be an expert on climate change or sustainability. I got involved with it about 20 years ago. I wrote something for FAO WHO, and so I've been periodically asked to speak on it. But I'm very interested in it, and it's certainly an important topic. I'm not going to give you a lot of my bio information. You can look me up on the web. I trained a lot of students. I got a lot of money. I published a lot of papers. I was on a lot of panels. I do want to thank the people who were involved in this session that we had on Sunday, I guess it was, where we talked about initiatives that ILSI can be involved in with respect to climate change and sustainability. And I really hope that this symposium will help to provide a little bit more background information and also maybe stimulate some conversation into the future. Okay, so I'm specifically going to give you some information by way of background and talk very specifically about food safety implications of sustainability and climate change. So with that, in the U.S. here, we're pretty much required to claim what our conflicts of interest are. I have none in this regard. So my outline is going to be largely some definitions, which will serve to support what the other individuals in this session are speaking about. I'm going to give you some specific examples of food safety impacts from climate change and some of those implications. I'm going to then jump into the same for sustainability and then wind up with some conclusions. So the two definitions that I chose for this presentation for global climate change and for global warming come from, as you can see, one comes from the World Bank and one comes from NASA. And the difference really between the two is that global climate change is considered variability, okay, or variation in average weather change or average weather patterns over a long period of time, really a period of decades. We kind of interchangeably use those terms, climate change and global warming. But keep in mind that really global warming is more associated with what we call anthropogenic changes. Okay, so those are changes that are associated with human activities post or during, sort of during and then post-industrial revolution. If you look at the models that predict global climate change impacts, the current projection is an increase of about 1.5 to almost 6 degrees centigrade rise in air temperatures and a precipitation increase of up to 15%. So we're talking major impacts to just those two variables in our climate. Now, with that said, there are a lot more manifestations to global climate change than just those. And I love the term, I can't remember who said this to me years ago. It's really not global warming, it's global weirding. Okay, so the weather is just getting really strange. So we have temperature changes, we have precipitation changes, but that includes both precipitation increases and decreases, so it includes droughts. Certainly because of damages to the ozone layer, we have increased exposure to sunlight or to ultraviolet in particular, and this quote climate variability, which has, we all, I think, no matter where we live, have dealt with or are increasingly dealing with these catastrophic weather events. I mean, I know just in Canada this past year, they had massive problems with forest fires, which were in part impacted by global climate change. This results in a variety of manifestations. You can see some of them here. All of the, things like sea level and salinity, crop yields, quality of soil, nitrogen deposition, plant diversity. All of these, in many ways, impact agriculture and food production in one way or another. What I am going to focus on here in this presentation really is the human disease aspect to that, mostly infectious disease. I stuck this slide in because I have a very strong belief system that food is water and water is food. If you do not have a safe food supply, safe water supply, you will not have a safe food supply. So while I'm talking about food in general, it's important to realize that anything that's happening to our water supply is going to impact the quality and safety of our food supply. So this is a bit of a fussy figure. It's one I pulled actually out of a sustainable packaging paper. But what it basically is doing is looking at all the different nodes in the food supply chain and in the production chain, and how specifically those nodes can impact microbes, okay, or human health risks. So the ones that I'm most interested in are bacteria, viruses, fungi, parasitic protozoa. But there are other important human health risks, such as chemicals, such as prions, mad cow disease, and byproducts of microorganisms that also can cause disease in humans. And if you look at any one of these nodes, I think you look at there's a little icon that looks like a little paramecium. You can see the paramecium kind of pops up all over the place. So with almost every aspect in the mode of food production, processing, and even into consumption, there are going to be impacts to public health relative to these infectious agents. So what are some of those impacts? I tried to come up with a really broad statement, and what I came up with is, in general, you will see changes in the prevalence, occurrence, distribution, and concentration of some of these important organisms and or their metabolic byproducts. You're going to see changes in the distribution, growth, and survival of these guys. And you're going to see changes in their pathogenic potential. And that will be in water and food systems, and then that will then yield changes in food and in human and animal consumption and in associated disease. A great example that we're going to talk about in just a minute is global expansion of harmful algal blooms. The overarching principle, and this is what I talk about in my food microbiology class all the time, is it's all about competition. Okay, so these guys are growing in systems, in food and environmental systems, and the conditions that are optimal for any one of them is going to promote the growth of that organism and suppress the growth of others. So really we're looking at changes in balance of microorganisms that are largely naturally present, that oftentimes only make people sick when they're in very high concentrations, okay? So it's all about the competition and how the environmental changes are changing the means by which these guys compete. There's also increases of fungal growth and the formation of mycotoxins. We'll talk briefly about that. Certainly elevated risk for emerging zoonoses. A zoonosis is a disease that is transmitted from animals to humans. Elevated increased potential for veterinary drug residues and antibiotic resistance and pesticide use issues, which I'm not going to talk about specifically in this presentation. So probably the best example, the most straightforward example of the impact of global climate change to infectious agents that cause human disease are what are called the shellfish toxins, or the toxic dinoflagellates. These are naturally occurring organisms that rise and fall in levels as a consequence of water temperatures. It can be fresh or salt waters, water temperatures, nutrient composition, and oftentimes in response to diversion of waterways, which you might see in the case of damming or something like that. And you can see here, these are the data for paralytic shellfish poisoning, which is just one of the toxic dinoflagellate diseases, in 1970 and in 2017. Okay, and everywhere you see a red is a documented outbreak. Well, what do you see here? You see changes in the first of all, many more outbreaks. Second of all, you're seeing changes in the distribution of where these outbreaks are occurring. In particular, many, many more are occurring in northern areas of the world. And in my world of looking at climate change relative to food safety, this is probably one of the best examples. And usually people get these guys from foods by consumption of molluscan shellfish or other seafood products. Also in the seafood and ocean realm are the toxic vibrios. So Vibrio is a very big family of bacteria that are naturally present in seawater. And there are two species, Volnificus and Parahemolyticus, that are specifically human pathogens. And what we've seen as ocean temperatures have risen over the last couple of decades, we're beginning to see the numbers of Vibrio cases in human populations to be increasing, particularly globally, and you can follow that, and also in the northern most regions of the United States where we have data. So these are the conditions for these guys to cause disease are increasing, and that's followed by the epidemiology where the numbers of cases are actually increasing. Now there's a really interesting anecdotal story. It's not really anecdotal, but I don't know if any of you recall, those of you a little bit older, there was an outbreak of cholera that occurred in Peru in the early 90s. And there were many factors that were associated with that cholera outbreak. But one of the factors is that the water temperatures in that region were about 3 to 5 degrees, the ocean water temperatures were about 3 to 5 degrees higher than normal. And they believed that that was a driver in the emergence of the disease cholera in that Peruvian population at that time. Now, this is a list of all the classic foodborne pathogens that many of you have heard of. If you look on the left-hand side, you'll see the names of the bugs. And if you look on the right-hand side, you'll see some of the factors or climate factors that might be impacting their changes in their prevalence and or distribution of disease in the population. Most of these pathogens peak in the summer and then they reduce in the fall. What we're seeing are things like extreme weather events, certainly changes in seasonality, higher air temperatures, higher water temperatures, all have the potential to change the dynamics of these existing pathogens. Now, with that said, if you actually look collectively at the data right now, we don't see a lot of this happening yet. But this is something that we could easily see as temperatures become higher and precipitation patterns become different. Okay, so another area that we're really concerned about is increases in fungal toxins. And most of you have heard of mycotoxin, of aflatoxin. That's certainly the one that tends to be, well, acute aflatoxicosis is a very, very severe disease, and of course it's associated with chronic liver dysfunction and liver cancer. But there are many, many, many other mycotoxins out there. And they're all very dependent. They're molds that produce these toxins that are then consumed. They are not only limited to cereal grains and feed grains, which is what we usually think of them as being limited to, but they're also in lots and lots of other commodities, like some of the specialty commodities like teas and coffees, certainly milk, sometimes meat. So a wide variety of our food chain is potentially, can potentially have mycotoxin issues. So whether impacts mycotoxin production in kind of two ways. It changes the way plants grow. So for example, plants may flower earlier, okay, and that may provide conditions whereby they can then become infected by these fungi. And it also, as they're infected, it also provides damage to the crop, which increases in further infection potential and also adds to the ability of the molds to grow to high levels and produce more toxin. And all of these are impacted by climate, right? And so you get these fungal infections and you get production of mycotoxins. And this is a list of just a few of the climate-related influences that are driving this concern about increasing levels of mycotoxins in these types of products. And one thing I really want to sort of bring to the forefront here is that it does appear for mycotoxins in particular, but for many of the global climate change related factors, that it is the lower income countries that are have a greater likelihood of being more severely impacted by these. So yeah, we're worried about it all over the world, but we're particularly worried about it in these lower income areas. This is just a quick, again, another really busy slide talking about emergence of zoonotic disease. Zoonotic disease, animals to humans, is pretty common by a variety of routes. Some of the key drivers for food and waterborne disease seem to be things like catastrophic weather events, flooding, overflow of sewage or animal wastes into waterways, and certainly things like the fact that if you have higher temperatures, you have shorter generation times, so your levels of pathogens can get to higher numbers. So I'm going to make a quick switch over to sustainability, and this is just going to be a very quick introduction, and I'm actually going to talk a little bit about some of the things that were talked about yesterday. This is a great definition of sustainability here. And what I really want to point out is within the FAO definition is there are three major impacts, one being economic, the second being social, and the third being environmental. I think you're probably going to talk about this. It's important to recognize two or three things here. These all interact together, okay, and they intersect in various ways. But we're never going to deal effectively with sustainability unless you deal with all three of these. I'm particularly interested in this one. I don't even have the expertise to address these other ones, but these other ones are super important drivers. So one of the big ways we're trying to deal with sustainability is to reduce food waste. And this is a great graph from a paper that actually looked at where most food waste is coming from on a global level. And you can see here that a huge driver in food waste is really at the consumer level. Now, with that said, waste is defined as anything that's thrown away, and so there's plenty of waste that's happening during production and processing, as well as distribution and storage. But the consumer is a big driver of food waste. Well, as a food safety professional, okay, I can tell you that as we try to reduce food waste with consumers, there are going to be issues with respect to food safety, or certainly considerations. And this gives just a couple of examples from a recent paper. One of my favorites is the use of use-by dates, okay? Because use-by dates are, by most consumers, assumed to be safety related. But by many companies, they're actually quality related, okay? And oftentimes, they're perceived quality related. So getting consumers and companies on sort of the same page relative to use-by dates is really important. Another one, which we see all the time, is these reusable bags. You know, people use reusable bags in grocery stores. They throw their meat in it, and they get contamination in the bags from the meat, which can then go on to contaminate or cross-contaminate other products. So these are some just really basic reasons why we have to consider food safety as we consider some of these sustainability initiatives. This is taken from a packaging paper, and there are many, certainly in the academic sector and in parts of industry, there are many people who are working specifically in what's called active packaging and intelligent packaging. Active packaging really includes things like antimicrobials or providing conditions which reduce the likelihood of either growth of spoilage organisms and or the growth of pathogens to increase the safety and shelf life of products. Usually this is done right in the package. Smart or intelligent packaging uses things like time temperature indicators or quality or safety indicators to allow the consumer to know, yeah, hey, this product is no longer safe or no longer edible, which can also help to extend shelf life and improve safety, and in so doing reduce food waste. There are a lot of green technologies, green being emerging technologies that use different mechanisms of inactivation or different products of inactivation. They're usually applied at the food processing level. Things like ozone, ultraviolet, high pressure. They tend to use a little bit less energy, so they become more eco-friendly. They're rapid, efficient, and effective. And there's much research being done on these technologies. I actually think you had a session last year at this conference on both green technologies as well as active and intelligent packaging. And I'm probably going to skip over the alternative protein sources and not go into a great detail because you had an entire session on that or yesterday afternoon. But these are kind of the major protein or alternative protein sources that are being developed for commercial application. And there are lots, and it was mentioned in passing at that session that there are lots of potential food safety issues that need to be considered as those reach a commercial market. I've underlined those in here, and certainly at your leisure, you can feel free to look through those slides. So I'm going to end with this, and that is that climate change and sustainability really are two different things, but they collide. And I love this slide. It shows it in the ocean, and I think we see this more in the ocean than we do in land at the current time. And it's a great example. So you have sustainability issues relative to plastics. We have an enormous problem with plastics in our oceans. You have climate change related issues in terms of fossil fuel use, things like oil spills and mercury. You also have climate change things in terms of manufactured chemicals and pesticides. More water means more runoff into oceans, for example. And all of those collide to give us what we are currently looking at as certainly an emerging crisis, if not already a crisis. So, to conclude, the collision of climate change and sustainability, what can we expect, or what are we already seeing? We're seeing changes in food safety risks. We definitely are seeing increased prevalence or risk of some of the known pathogens, like the toxic dinoflagellates. We're certainly altering the balance of prioritization. So we are probably going to be prioritizing one risk over another at some point. We're seeing the emergence of new pathogens. And probably in my 30-year career as a faculty member, the best illustration of that are the toxigenic E. coli strains, which we never had a problem with in the United States in fresh produce until approximately 15 or 20 years ago. And now it's the #1 agenda item on the Food and Drug Administration when it comes to food safety. Introduction of new products and how those impact food safety. It might make it more difficult or change how we manage food safety risks. And again, there are many unknown other factors. And so I'm not going to reiterate the inevitable, except I use this all the time. It's complicated, it depends. And much of this is going to be pretty much driven by unintended consequences, which means we're going to, and sometimes, be having to manage things by the seat of our pants. But it's not going anywhere, and we're definitely in uncharted territory. And with that, I will be happy to take probably a couple questions, if there are any.
Could you talk about maybe if there are changes that you're now seeing in the university curriculum when you look at, for example, you're studying food safety and microbiology and all these other things relative to climate change? It's not something that was ever on the curriculum in the past. I assume that the next generation of scientists are going to be thinking about climate change with respect to other scientific disciplines or not. What's happening?
I think that's a super good question. I think you're seeing little bits and pieces of it, but it's not necessarily in food safety. It's in agriculture in general. So I think one of the speakers yesterday talked about Tufts has a new center. That was news to me. I mean, I thought that what a great center, and why isn't it at a land-grant institution instead of at a private institution? But I have not seen, aside from that example, I've not seen a lot of curriculum. That's a really good question. Others?
Hi. So I was struck by the PSP slide, and we're doing a review of emerging biotoxins in the UK. And one of the things is, where do we get the signals from? And I wonder what your views were of monitoring in a period of global change, and we're going to get outbreaks or the emergence of species in some places they weren't, but how do we know, and how are we going to be prepared?
Yeah, and so the PSP example is a really good one because it's not, and I'm going to talk from the US perspective, okay? It's not on the radar of CDC. It's not like one of the, reportable diseases. So mostly we're getting that information from states that are reporting diseases, and then oftentimes it's academics who are collaborating or collating that data, I should say. And I do think there is a huge need to start having this conversation between countries, and maybe having more of a central resource whereby that information can be collected. I'll tell you, and I meant to say it in the presentation. So I grew up in Connecticut. So I grew up in the northeastern part of the United States. And I happened to be up there this summer, and they had, just in my community, had 3 cases of Vibrio vulnificus, which is almost universally fatal. And we had never had vulnificus up that far up the eastern coast of the United States. So I think there's a great need to do that. Who provides the resources to do that is a whole nother question.